The conventional recounting of the Indian Rebellion of 1857 often frames the early disasters, the massacres, the sieges, the breakdown of command, as the unavoidable, if tragic, result of a sudden, widespread mutiny. This narrative, largely codified by Victorian historians intent on preserving a facade of imperial competence, posits that the East India Company's military structure, while perhaps under-resourced, was fundamentally sound. The ensuing violence, they argue, was simply a catastrophic turn of luck, swiftly corrected by the eventual, inevitable arrival of superior British force and moral will. This perspective is not merely incomplete, it is a deliberate intellectual distortion. To understand the crisis that demanded the desperate intervention of General Havelock's column, we must first accept an uncomfortable truth. The failures that defined the summer of 1857 were not tactical surprises, but the direct, calculable consequence of systemic, high-level rot. The siege of Cawnpore and the subsequent agonizing relief of Lucknow did not occur because the sepoys betrayed the Raj. They occurred because the leadership in Calcutta and, crucially, in Whitehall, had already betrayed the fundamental principles of military logistics, sound strategy, and institutional self-awareness. This betrayal manifested most clearly in the Bengal Army. By the 1850s, this massive military body had become less a fighting force guided by professional doctrine and more an instrument of political patronage and entrenched complacency. Its officers, often appointed through social connections rather than merit, were increasingly disconnected from the men they commanded. They spoke little of the local languages, understood less of the local customs, and, most damningly, treated the principles of martial discipline and rigorous training with contempt. The intellectual vigor that had characterized the Duke of Wellington's campaigns had been supplanted by a pervasive culture of ease and entitlement. The Kanpur anomaly is the name we give to this contradiction, the existence of a seemingly overwhelming military force that was, beneath the surface of its brightly colored uniforms, strategically inert and structurally unsound. The institutional arrogance was so profound that all credible intelligence regarding disaffection was routinely dismissed, filed away as the unwarranted anxieties of low-level political officers or the ramblings of the unreliable native populace. The company's civilian administrators, intoxicated by 2 decades of easy territorial expansion, had convinced themselves that the sheer economic might and purported moral superiority of the British presence rendered a genuine military threat impossible. The result was a command structure paralyzed by an obsession with internal regulations rather than external threats. Military doctrine, where it existed, was applied rigidly and without context. Supplies were managed with notorious inefficiency. Critical reserves were often located hundreds of miles from where they were strategically needed, and the rapid movement of troops, the very cornerstone of effective counterinsurgency, was rendered impossible by a Byzantine logistical chain that prioritized bureaucratic process over battlefield reality. When the flashpoint arrived, precipitated by the entirely predictable outrage over the Enfield cartridge rumors, a crisis that any competent, connected command structure would have mitigated immediately, the High Command had no contingency plan beyond shock and reprisal. The initial response was characterized by confusion, inaction, and the fatal tendency to disperse small, valuable units into hopeless defensive positions. It is this institutional paralysis that General Havelock inherited. His advance was not the start of the conflict, it was the final, desperate attempt to mitigate the full, disastrous cost of years of negligence by a ruling class that had outsourced its duty to its ambition. To focus solely on the heroism of the bayonet charge at the end is to ignore the crucial scholarly indictment, that the need for that charge was created entirely by the calculated political blindness and systemic moral failure at the highest echelons of British power. The military genius of Havelock was required precisely because the accepted narrative of competence that preceded him was an absolute, costly lie. The true burden of the rebellion, therefore, lies not just in the bloody fighting, but in the political corruption that made that fighting inevitable. The initial spark of the Enfield cartridge was merely the ignition. The true powder keg of the 1857 rebellion was fashioned by decades of profound geopolitical miscalculation and a systemic, morally bankrupt pursuit of short-term economic gain. The conventional history often glosses over the economic imperatives that drove the East India Company's policy, preferring to cast the conflict as a clash of civilizations or a religious feud. This is a scholarly dereliction. The true stakes were not spiritual or ethnic, but fiscal and structural. The company's rule, particularly in the vital agrarian regions of the northwest provinces and Oudh, had systematically dismantled the established socio-economic framework in a relentless drive for revenue maximization. The system of land tenure, the bedrock of Indian society and stability, was ruthlessly revised. The traditional talukdars, landlords or barons, who served as the critical mediating layer between the peasant farmer and the central authority, were stripped of their ancestral rights, often through deliberate, labyrinthine legal processes designed to favor company officials and their newly created zamindar clients. This was not administrative reform, it was a vast, state-sanctioned transfer of wealth and power executed with staggering indifference to social consequence. The result was a vast, dispossessed class, highly militarized and utterly alienated from the ruling power. The common peasant, now subjected to an impersonal, unforgiving revenue system that demanded cash payment regardless of harvest yield or climatic disaster, faced financial ruin and the imminent threat of debt servitude. This economic insecurity provided the fertile ground for discontent, transforming localized grievances into a revolutionary impulse. The financial corruption was not a side effect of the company's rule, it was the engine of its destabilization. This relentless pursuit of profit was directly tied to the geopolitical strategy, or lack thereof, emanating from London. The doctrine of laissez-faire imperialism, championed by powerful banking and shipping interests in Parliament, treated India less as a sovereign territory to be governed and more as a reservoir of capital to be extracted. This meant that funds critically required for military investment, modernization, and the maintenance of adequate logistical infrastructure were routinely diverted or suppressed. The Bengal army, while vast, became an army designed for internal policing and minor annexations, not for fighting a large-scale, unified civil war. The annexation of Oudh in 1856 stands as the ultimate political blunder, a crowning act of avarice that directly precipitated the uprising. Lord Dalhousie, under the pretext of misrule, absorbed the last major independent kingdom, shattering the delicate balance of alliances and treaties. Oudh was the primary recruiting ground for the Bengal army's Hindu and Muslim sepoys. By displacing their traditional aristocratic patrons and subjecting their families to the ruinous new revenue codes, the company effectively turned its most loyal and formidable military resource against itself. Furthermore, the systemic corruption in Calcutta mirrored that in Whitehall. Senior company officers and civil servants viewed their Indian posting not as a sacred duty, but as a limited-time opportunity to amass a personal fortune before retirement. This led to pervasive negligence in provisioning, arms procurement, and intelligence gathering. Vast sums earmarked for improving barracks, paying local auxiliaries, or modernizing obsolete fortresses simply vanished into private accounts. The command structure became brittle and unresponsive, built on outdated, Eurocentric assumptions. The High Command assumed that Indian loyalty was a fixed commodity, a permanent fixture derived from British military superiority. They failed entirely to grasp the sophisticated network of kinship, caste, and economic dependency that governed the sepoy regiments. When the economic and social foundations supporting the sepoy's life outside the barracks collapsed, thanks to the land reforms and the Oudh annexation, his loyalty inside the barracks became instantly void. Thus, the events of 1857 were not a sudden tragedy, but a systemic reckoning. The immediate tactical challenge faced by General Havelock, the need for a desperate, bloody breakthrough, was the geopolitical bill coming due. The siege was not a battle for a single garrison. It was a battle against the rotten foundations of the Company Raj itself, foundations undermined by decades of greed and political expediency that prioritized the interests of city financiers over the enduring stability of the empire. The moral failures of the ruling class made the bloodshed of the field a certainty. The immediate and devastating tactical losses of 1857 were not a consequence of sepoy superiority in the field, but the inevitable military manifestation of a prolonged political betrayal orchestrated far from the battle lines. This betrayal was embodied in the doctrine of expediency, a ruling philosophy in Calcutta and London that systematically prioritized immediate financial savings and short-term political appeasement over long-term strategic integrity and the basic tenets of competent military governance. This doctrine operated on several destructive levels. Firstly, it led to a deliberate and continuous under-resourcing of the European component of the Bengal army. Political figures in the East India Company, constantly seeking to minimize operational expenditure to maximize dividends for shareholders, resisted any suggestion of increasing the proportion of expensive, reliable European infantry and artillery. They operated under the dangerously false assumption that the Sepoy army's loyalty was absolute and thus, the numerical imbalance, roughly 5 Indian soldiers to every 1 European, was economically justifiable. This expediency, driven by the ledger book, rendered the remaining European forces strategically thin, forcing them into overextended garrisons that were easily overwhelmed once the loyalty of the native troops fractured. Secondly, the doctrine of expediency directly corrupted the logistical preparedness of the entire military infrastructure. In the decades leading up to 1857, critical funds for modernizing the movement of troops and material, such as the early implementation of railways or the maintenance of strategic road networks, were routinely vetoed or drastically curtailed. The result was that when the crisis erupted, the few available European forces could not be concentrated rapidly enough to address the scattered flashpoints. Generals like Havelock, when finally ordered to move, were condemned to agonizing, disease-ridden foot marches during the monsoon season, fighting the logistical clock as much as the enemy. This systemic negligence ensured that tactical swiftness, the bedrock of any successful counterinsurgency, was rendered an impossibility by administrative parsimony. The most insidious manifestation of this political malfeasance, however, was the betrayal of command autonomy. The East India Company's civilian administration, jealous of its overall political control, deliberately fostered an environment where military command was subordinated to political meddling. Senior commanders were frequently overridden by non-military political officers concerned more with local revenue collection or appeasing specific regional interests than with maintaining military readiness. This created a culture where initiative was punished and bureaucratic caution rewarded. Crucially, it led to a fundamental breakdown in the chain of intelligence. Warnings from military professionals regarding simmering discontent were often ignored by political officers who saw such reports as threats to their own perceived administrative stability. The result was a paralyzed high command, incapable of independent, decisive action when the mutinies began. The annexation of Oudh, previously discussed as a geopolitical blunder, serves as the perfect military example of this expediency. The political calculus dictated the seizure of the wealthy kingdom for its revenue, despite explicit military warnings that Oudh provided the very core of the Sepoy army's most dedicated, yet socially sensitive, recruits. The civilian desire for immediate financial gain utterly eclipsed the military imperative for long-term personnel loyalty. The political leadership willfully dismantled the socio-economic foundation of its own army for a short-term treasury boost. General Havelock and others were not simply fighting a rebel army. They were fighting the accumulated, disastrous legacy of decades of institutionalized self-interest. Every inadequate supply cache, every slow march, every isolated, vulnerable garrison that fell was a direct measure of the political class's decision to sacrifice military competence on the altar of administrative convenience and financial expediency. The musket fired only because the political foundation had already been thoroughly undermined, transforming a controllable crisis into an existential military emergency that demanded feats of impossible odds merely to survive. The geographical reality alone presented an almost insurmountable obstacle. The core theatres of the rebellion, Cawnpore, Lucknow, and the surrounding regions, were isolated by the onset of the monsoon season. This was not merely heavy rain. It was a torrential climatic event that transformed the Indian countryside into a swamp. Rivers swelled into impassable torrents, destroying fragile bridges and rendering established road networks, which were poorly maintained even in dry weather, into ribbons of impassable mud. The capacity for rapid movement, already compromised by the doctrine of expediency, was effectively eliminated. Every mile advanced became a brutal, energy-sapping struggle against the terrain itself. This climatic reality directly amplified the logistical collapse. Havelock's small column, composed of weary European and loyal native regiments, could not rely on the local foraging or requisitioning that typically sustained an army on the march. The entire region was hostile, and even if supplies could be secured, transporting them was a feat of Herculean engineering. The failure of the East India Company to invest in adequate transport infrastructure, draft animals, robust carts, and dedicated supply depots, meant that the advancing force was perpetually on the razor's edge of starvation and material shortage. The official records reveal a command preoccupied not with battle plans, but with securing the next day's grain and the next 100 rounds of serviceable ammunition. This constant state of deficiency eroded combat effectiveness before a shot was even fired. The strategic quagmire was further deepened by the disastrous sequence of events that preceded Havelock's command. The fall of Cawnpore, Kanpur, and the subsequent massacres, the immediate horror of which sent a psychological shockwave across India and Britain, created a dual strategic objective of immense difficulty. First, Havelock was charged with exacting retribution, a political necessity to restore the flagging morale and authority of the Raj. Second, and militarily more critical, he had to effect the relief of the Lucknow Residency, where hundreds of European women, children, and loyal sepoys were holding out under a brutal, protracted siege. These two objectives were mutually exclusive in their demands. The march toward Cawnpur was grueling enough, but the decision to press on immediately towards Lucknow, with an exhausted, disease-ridden force, violated every orthodox military principle of preparation and rest. The pressure to relieve Lucknow was not merely tactical, it was psychological and political. The British public, inflamed by the news from Cawnpur, was demanding immediate action, regardless of cost. This external political pressure exerted a crushing, non-military weight on Havelock, forcing him into a series of high-risk, low-percentage tactical gambles. The information environment was equally hostile. The company's intelligence network had disintegrated. Havelock was operating in a fog of war, relying on rudimentary, often conflicting local reports concerning the strength, disposition, and motivation of the rebel forces, which were rapidly consolidating around powerful leaders. The enemy's knowledge of the local terrain and their ability to melt away into the countryside after skirmishes gave them a decisive operational advantage. The weight of neglect was therefore the invisible enemy, the exhaustion of the troops from walking through knee-deep mud, the rampant spread of cholera and dysentery due to poor sanitation and the monsoon, the constant dread of the unknown size of the rebel forces ahead, and the absolute, crushing knowledge that if they failed, the fate awaiting the besieged at Lucknow was unthinkable. This cumulative effect of physical hardship, logistical failure, and moral responsibility defined the strategic context. Havelock was not leading an army of relief, he was leading a desperate wager against time, disease, and the long-ignored consequences of political treachery. The odds were, by all sober military calculation, effectively zero. The name Henry Havelock is today usually invoked in the context of Victorian heroism, a stiff-backed, pious officer whose success at Lucknow is cast as a miracle of sheer will. This popular image is, however, another misleading simplification, deliberately cultivated to obscure the true source of his triumph, a deeply internalized, nonconformist military doctrine forged over 40 years of obscurity and institutional resistance. Havelock's genius was not derived from spontaneous inspiration but from a rigorous, scholarly commitment to neglected principles, making him, in essence, a forgotten genius whose ideas predated their wide acceptance. Havelock's formative years in the military were spent not in the spotlight, but in the grueling, often thankless, campaigns of Burma, Afghanistan, and the Sikh Wars. Crucially, he was a student of war in an era when many British officers were gentlemen adventurers. He did not merely participate in battles, he meticulously documented, analyzed, and synthesized the lessons of military history, particularly those of the Duke of Wellington. While his peers pursued social standing and political patronage, Havelock pursued professional competence with an almost religious fervor, publishing detailed reports and pamphlets that were frequently ignored by a high command suspicious of intellectualism. The core of Havelock's formative doctrine rested on three principles that ran directly counter to the prevalent, complacent orthodoxy of the Bengal army: logistical rigor, tactical concentration, and the moral integrity of command. Firstly, logistical rigor was, to Havelock, the true foundation of operational freedom. He understood that in a theater as vast and unpredictable as India, the capacity to move men and material swiftly and reliably was the precondition for victory. He meticulously planned every aspect of supply and transport, demanding precision that his quartermasters often resented. While the conventional officer relied on haphazard local requisitioning and dismissed illness as an unavoidable cost of climate, Havelock saw disease and supply failure as logistical crimes, direct evidence of command incompetence. His success in the First Afghan War and the early campaigns in 1857 was less about battlefield dash and more about having just enough food, water, and ammunition at the critical point, a competence entirely foreign to the surrounding administrative rot. Secondly, tactical concentration was the answer to fighting numerically superior forces. The prevailing British method in India often relied on the brute force of massive columns or, conversely, the dispersal of small garrisons. Havelock, however, favored the rapid concentration of highly trained infantry supported by disciplined, overwhelming artillery fire at the decisive point. His doctrine scorned the notion of protracted sieges or indecisive skirmishing. Instead, he drilled his men in the art of the rapid, disciplined advance, relying on volley fire and the bayonet charge not as a last resort, but as a calculated mechanism for psychological shock and immediate tactical resolution. This required an intense level of training and discipline, which he instilled through tireless personal example, a requirement that generated institutional resistance from officers accustomed to indolence. This brings us to his third principle, the moral integrity of command. For Havelock, duty was a moral, theological imperative. He treated his men, both European and loyal native, with a strict, but unwavering fairness, demanding discipline but ensuring their welfare. He was notorious for his lack of patience with institutional incompetence and betrayal, recognizing that the system's reliance on cronyism and financial self-interest was a greater threat than any enemy general. This unyielding moral stance was what placed him at odds with the political elite. He was repeatedly passed over for promotion, sidelined, and treated as a minor irritant, a man whose competence was undeniable but whose ethical rigidity made him politically inconvenient. His long service in subordinate roles was less a reflection of his ability and more a testament to the institutional resistance faced by any genuine professional in an establishment defined by patronage. Havelock's doctrine was thus the antithesis of the Bengal army's ethos. Where the latter valued appearance, social connection, and ease, Havelock valued professional scrutiny, detailed preparation, and moral accountability. His rise to command in 1857 was not a planned ascent but a reluctant, last-minute necessity. The system, having failed spectacularly through its own ingrained incompetence, was forced to turn to the one man whose forgotten principles offered the only viable path out of the strategic quagmire. He was the forgotten genius, not because he was unrecognized, but because his rigorous, professional, and morally serious doctrine was actively rejected by the political expediency that defined the Raj. He was given the command only when the scale of the preceding betrayals made the task effectively impossible for anyone else. Havelock's principles, detailed in the preceding chapter, were not merely a preferred methodology. They represented an existential indictment of the prevailing institutional culture of the East India Company's military establishment. His career before 1857 was a protracted, often bitter, battle against the status quo, a system that actively resisted meritocracy, rewarded cronyism, and mistook procedural compliance for actual operational readiness. The resistance he faced was not personal enmity, but the reflexive institutional rejection of competence that threatened the comfortable indolence of the established hierarchy. The primary point of friction was Havelock's insistence on professional scrutiny and accountability. The Bengal army, in the decades preceding the rebellion, was structured less on professional criteria and more on the purchase system and political patronage. Commissions and high-level appointments were frequently secured through financial means or social connections, leading to a senior officer corps riddled with mediocrity, lack of linguistic skills, and profound indifference to the operational welfare of their native troops. Havelock, a man of modest means and profound professional seriousness, challenged this entire structure simply by adhering to Wellingtonian standards of discipline, training, and logistical detail. This commitment translated into specific, unpopular demands. Havelock insisted on tireless, rigorous drill far beyond the comfortable minimum accepted by his peers. He saw training not as a formality but as the absolute guarantor of survival under fire, particularly for rapidly moving light infantry, his preferred tactical tool. This emphasis on strenuous, continuous training was viewed by many of his contemporaries, particularly those whose ranks were secured through social standing, as a needless, puritanical obsession. His detailed critiques of supply chain failures, his insistence on accurate medical reporting, and his unwillingness to overlook even minor disciplinary infractions exposed the slackness of his superiors, generating a deliberate, cooling effect from the establishment. The sheer military challenge facing Havelock in the summer of 1857 was not simply the presence of a determined rebel force, but the strategic disadvantage accumulated through the anatomical failures of command that preceded his arrival. The narrative of impossible odds is only fully realized when one dissects the specific tactical blunders committed by the orthodox command structure, blunders that served to fortify the rebellion, squander scarce resources, and condemn the besieged to prolonged agony. These were not minor errors. They were systemic misapplications of doctrine that directly contrasted with Havelock's professional principles. The most catastrophic blunder was the failure of timely concentration and relief. Military doctrine dictates that in the face of a rapidly escalating insurgency, the first priority is the swift concentration of reliable forces to strike decisively at the center of the rebellion. Instead, the High Command, paralyzed by local political pressures and a pervasive overestimation of the sepoy loyalty in individual garrisons, committed the fatal error of dispersion. Small, vulnerable European and loyal native units were left isolated across vast territories. These small detachments were then individually targeted and overwhelmed, leading to the rapid loss of critical strategic points and the shocking massacres that further fueled the rebellion's momentum. The initial, timid responses prioritized the perceived safety of individual posts over the necessity of achieving a decisive operational mass. A second, equally devastating failure was the misapplication of artillery doctrine. When relief columns were eventually dispatched, they often suffered from a disastrous imbalance. The conventional British approach favored heavy siege artillery, necessary for bombarding fixed defenses. However, the early rebel forces were highly mobile, utilizing hit-and-run tactics and rapidly shifting field positions. The cumbersome, slow-moving heavy ordnance fatally slowed down the already logistically hobbled relief columns. Commanders failed to prioritize fast-moving, horse artillery batteries, the very asset Havelock would later use to great effect, which could support a rapid infantry advance and quickly silence mobile rebel guns. The inability of these early columns to move with the speed necessary to outflank or surprise the enemy ensured they were often met by prepared defenses, leading to high, unsustainable casualties and subsequent tactical retreats. Furthermore, the preceding commands demonstrated a profound incompetence in reconnaissance and terrain analysis. Repeatedly, early attempts to push through to Cawnpore or Agra relied on obvious, well-known lines of advance, the major roads or river routes. The rebel commanders, possessing superior local knowledge and the advantage of internal intelligence, easily anticipated these movements. Relief columns were thus led into prepared ambushes or confronted with unexpected, heavily fortified positions. This failure was rooted in the caste of European officers who disdained local intelligence gathering and often refused to engage meaningfully with the topographical or demographic realities of the operational theater. This arrogance translated directly into tactical predictability. A defining example of this overall incompetence was the haphazard use of time. The early commanders treated the clock as an irrelevance. Long halts for rest, delays imposed by bureaucratic squabbling over transport, and an overall lack of urgency defined the movement of forces desperately needed at the siege lines. Every day of delay meant the weakening of the besieged garrison, the reinforcement of the enemy's positions, and the further demoralization of the loyal populace. The strategic timeline was dictated not by military necessity but by the comfortable pace of peacetime administration. The cumulative effect of these failures, dispersion, inappropriate logistical planning, predictable advances, and fatal delays, was the creation of the exact impossible odds Havelock was forced to confront. The rebel command, observing the disorganization and tactical timidity of the initial counterattacks, grew in confidence and improved its defensive coordination. When Havelock finally took command, he was not marching against a collection of disorganized mutineers, but against a reinforced, battle-hardened, and highly confident enemy whose strategic position had been inadvertently strengthened by the very forces previously tasked with defeating them. Havelock's success, therefore, was not merely a victory over the rebels, but a definitive, public repudiation of the anatomically unsound doctrine that had characterized the Bengal Army's high command for decades. His first and most crucial tactical decision was to overturn every one of these preceding blunders, embracing speed, light artillery, and immediate offensive action as the only viable corrective to the strategic hole the status quo had dug. For General Henry Havelock, the assumption of command was not a moment of triumph, but the crushing realization of the full burden of systemic neglect. He inherited not an army, but a fragment of hope, a small, mixed column of British and loyal Indian regiments, the 78th Highlanders, the 64th Regiment, elements of the 84th, and a crucial corps of Sikh and other native infantry, all desperately needed to cover a vast distance through hostile terrain and overwhelming enemy presence. The initial push towards Cawnpore and then Lucknow demanded a commitment to a pace that was, by all conventional military standards, suicidal. This initial desperate push was defined less by spectacular battles and more by attrition before contact. Havelock's first and most critical battle was against the elements and the clock. The advance began under the full fury of the monsoon, transforming the rich Gangetic plain into a nightmarish morass. The roads were virtually non-existent, every step cost undue physical energy. The troops, already weakened by the climate and the stresses of the early rebellion, succumbed rapidly to disease and exhaustion. Cholera, dysentery, and heatstroke exacted a higher toll than any rebel musket could in those early weeks. Havelock's columns were forced to march and fight in an environment where even basic survival was a testament to endurance, a reality utterly divorced from the comfortable experience of high-ranking officers in London. The logistical genius required to sustain this advance was extraordinary, and it rested entirely on Havelock's decades-long commitment to rigorous planning. His decisions regarding supply trains were brutal yet necessary. He deliberately stripped the column of excess baggage and non-essential stores, prioritizing speed and combat readiness over comfort and convenience. This was a radical rejection of the established, slow-moving British logistical doctrine. The small size of his supply chain, though a vulnerability, was also its strength, allowing for faster movement through the saturated landscape. The psychological toll of the advance was palpable. News of the atrocities at Cawnpore, though galvanizing in some respects, imposed a crushing moral imperative. The troops were acutely aware that every hour lost meant another 100 souls within the Lucknow residency were closer to death. This moral urgency was a powerful, if unsustainable, form of fuel, demanding repeated feats of endurance that violated all norms of rest and recovery. Havelock, the deeply moral commander, understood the weight of this responsibility, yet he was forced to drive his exhausted men beyond the point of collapse, recognizing that the only failure that mattered was the failure to arrive in time. Havelock's command philosophy during this initial phase was a stark display of practical professionalism against the backdrop of strategic chaos. He personally oversaw the logistical details, ensured the sick were attended to, though resources were woefully inadequate, and maintained an unyielding personal discipline. He knew that any lapse in command integrity would quickly cascade into a total collapse of morale. He demanded discipline not through theatrical severity, but through absolute consistency and the demonstration that his commanders shared the same privations as the common soldier. When the column did encounter rebel resistance, the engagements, such as those at Fatehpur, were characterized by a ruthless, economical use of force. Havelock could not afford protracted engagements or high casualties. His doctrine of tactical concentration came to the fore, rapid deployment of his disciplined infantry, supported by quickly positioned light artillery to shatter the enemy's formation, followed by an immediate, focused infantry charge to rout them before they could reform. These early victories were not showcases of power, but desperate actions to clear the path, securing just enough time and morale to continue the relentless advance. The strategic irony of this advance cannot be overstated. Havelock was successful in these early skirmishes precisely because the enemy did not anticipate such unorthodox speed and such fierce, disciplined aggression from a force that, by all accounts, should have been stalled by the terrain and attrition. The preceding commanders had moved at a predictable crawl, Havelock moved at a desperate sprint. This calculated risk of attrition, trading the lives lost to disease and exhaustion for the lives saved by speed, was the agonizing truth of his command. Every mile gained was a testament to his logistical foresight and the impossible sacrifice demanded of his men, all necessary to overcome the strategic deficit created by his politically incompetent predecessors. He was, in effect, fighting a two-front war, one against the rebels, and one against the crippling physical limitations imposed by years of neglect and expediency. The skirmishes that defined Havelock's initial advance, the desperate, exhausting march detailed previously, culminated in the Battle of Feitspa on July 12, 1857. This engagement, often relegated to a footnote in the grand narrative of the rebellion, was in fact the crucial operational test and the proof of principle for Havelock's long-ignored doctrine. It was here that he demonstrated, with bloody precision, the efficacy of his unorthodox approach, proving that a small, disciplined force, operating at speed, could shatter a numerically superior enemy that relied on fixed, predictable defenses. The rebel forces at Feitspa, estimated to be considerably larger than Havelock's tired column, had positioned themselves strategically across the main road, utilizing the local topography, including dense groves and village walls, to establish a strong, entrenched defensive line. They possessed a significant advantage in artillery pieces, which, following the tactical blueprints of previous, slow-moving British columns, they expected to employ in a protracted, defensive engagement. The orthodox response would have been a cautious, time-consuming deployment of heavy batteries, a preparatory bombardment, and a slow, frontal infantry assault, a method that would have decimated Havelock's already fragile force. Havelock, however, chose speed and shock. The engagement began not with the expected slow preparation, but with a rapid, aggressive deployment that caught the rebel command entirely off guard. His key doctrinal application was the deployment of his light, highly mobile field artillery, batteries of 9-pounders and 24-pounder howitzers. These guns, specifically chosen for their mobility and rate of fire, were swiftly brought into action. They did not engage in a prolonged duel. Instead, Havelock ordered them to concentrate their fire with lethal precision on the rebel artillery positions. This maneuver, aimed at achieving immediate fire superiority, was crucial. The rebel gunners, accustomed to the predictable, slow-firing tactics of the traditional British heavy guns, were unnerved by the rapidity and focused violence of Havelock's smaller batteries. Once the enemy's artillery was either silenced or psychologically shaken, Havelock launched his infantry. This was where his commitment to tactical concentration paid its greatest dividend. He did not engage along the entire front. Instead, he utilized the 78th Highlanders and other reliable regiments in a highly disciplined, concentrated advance against the enemy's perceived flanks or the weakest points in their line. The infantry's maneuver was characterized by relentless advance under fire and the meticulous use of volley discipline. Unlike previous, less trained columns that often wasted ammunition in nervous, ill-aimed individual fire, Havelock's men delivered coordinated volleys that maximized the killing effect of the Enfield rifle at short range. This disciplined fire suppressed the rebel infantry, preparing them for the decisive maneuver. The final act at Feitspa was the bayonet charge, the physical embodiment of Havelock's belief in the overwhelming psychological power of concentrated force. The Highlanders and Sikh troops, having advanced relentlessly, crashed into the rebel lines. The enemy, shaken by the precision artillery and the disciplined, close-quarters volley fire, lacked the cohesion and morale to withstand the cold shock of the bayonet. The charge was not a desperate gamble, it was the calculated climax of a highly synchronized operation designed to break the enemy's will, not merely their lines. The rebel forces broke and fled, abandoning their positions and, significantly, their heavy artillery, which Havelock's column immediately seized and incorporated into their own depleted arsenal. The victory was economical in its expenditure of life and material, a critical success given Havelock's fragile logistical position. He suffered minimal casualties compared to the enemy, a direct proof of the efficacy of his doctrine. The Battle of Fatesburg did more than just clear the road to Cawnpore, it validated every principle Havelock had spent decades advocating: the necessity of light, fast-moving forces, the tactical supremacy of concentrated fire, and the overwhelming power of moral discipline instilled through rigorous training. It provided the indispensable proof of principle to his weary men and, perhaps more importantly, demonstrated to the wider rebel command that this was a new, frighteningly effective kind of opponent. Havelock's force was small, but its methods were ruthlessly effective, replacing the predictable ponderousness of the status quo with unorthodox, overwhelming aggression. This battle became the crucial strategic bridge between the logistical struggle of the advance and the subsequent, more complex urban fighting that lay ahead. It was the moment the Forgotten Doctrine ceased to be an academic theory and became a terrifying military reality. For a commander facing overwhelming numerical superiority and acute logistical strain, the traditional military maxim dictates caution, entrenchment, and the husbanding of resources for a protracted defense. Havelock, however, adhered to an entirely unorthodox view of defense, that in his specific, high-risk situation, the only viable defense was a relentless, calculated offense. This radical doctrine was the direct antithesis of the conservative, risk-averse posture that characterized the institutional failures of the Bengal army. It was a principle forged by the brutal geopolitical arithmetic of the summer of 1857. Havelock understood that his mission was defined not by capturing territory, but by time. The survival of the besieged in the Lucknow residency was contingent upon a rapid relief, measured in days, not weeks. Any delay, any pause for consolidation or rest, the conventional defensive response, would only afford the rebel forces the crucial time to reinforce their positions, improve their siege lines, and, most critically, wear down the physical and psychological resolve of the garrison. In Havelock's calculation, delay was the true military risk, a greater threat than any pitched battle. The traditional concept of defense, building trenches and waiting for reinforcements, was therefore a guarantee of mission failure. His doctrine of the offensive was thus a strategic framework applied to a tactical reality. It required a near-continuous march and immediate engagement with any enemy force encountered. This was a logistical gamble of the highest order. By prioritizing speed over supply line security and tactical engagement over rest, he willingly accepted the staggering rates of attrition due to disease and exhaustion, the calculated sacrifice of the physically weakest, to ensure the survival of the mission itself. This decision reflects the profound, morally serious burden of his command. He traded individual lives lost to non-combat factors for the mass survival of the besieged. This unorthodox approach was immediately evident in the critical decision to press on from Cawnpore towards Lucknow. After the grueling march and the decisive, yet exhausting, battles like Fatesburg and Ayong, the orthodox military mind would have dictated an extended period of rest and reinforcement at the newly secured base of operations. Havelock recognized this as a fatal trap. The political and moral pressure emanating from London and Calcutta, combined with the desperate reports from Lucknow, mandated absolute urgency. He correctly calculated that the strategic value of a quick arrival at Lucknow outweighed the tactical risk of advancing with an exhausted, undersized force. Furthermore, the offensive was crucial for morale and psychological warfare. Every rapid, aggressive advance, and every successful, swift engagement, served two purposes. For Havelock's own troops, it sustained the momentum necessary to overcome their physical exhaustion, proving that their sacrifices were leading to tangible progress. For the enemy, the relentless offensive shattered the conventional expectation of British military movement. The rebel commanders, expecting a measured, predictable advance, were destabilized by Havelock's aggressive omnipresence. The offensive was, in this sense, a form of active defense, keeping the enemy off balance and denying them the opportunity to systematically consolidate their defenses ahead of the column. This strategic choice was explicitly anti-institutional. The vast, cumbersome bureaucracy of the Company Raj was designed to facilitate slow, meticulous operations. Havelock's preference for rapid, light columns and immediate engagement bypassed the need for lengthy political consultations and logistical requisitions. He seized the initiative and held it tightly, denying his politically minded superiors the opportunity to paralyze his operation with bureaucratic delays or conservative advice. He acted as an autonomous, self-sufficient force, recognizing that in a crisis created by systemic incompetence, only unbridled, rapid decisiveness could succeed. In summary, Havelock's defense was not about holding ground. It was about seizing the initiative and the psychological high ground through ceaseless, aggressive movement. His doctrine was that his small force could only survive by fighting forward, constantly putting the pressure on a larger, but less cohesive, enemy. To stop was to allow the enemy to reorganize, and for the political inertia of the status quo to reassert its fatal grip. His advance was a desperate, necessary gamble, where the only viable defense against the strategic quagmire was the sustained, ferocious shock of the offense. The subsequent phases of the operation would demonstrate the terrifying physical cost of this high-stakes strategic choice. The strategic relief of the Lucknow Residency was not merely a matter of breaking through a rebel army. It was a brutal, forced march into a specific, unforgiving geographical reality that transformed the operation into a textbook case of urban and topographical warfare. Chapter 11 must dissect the impossible ground of the Lucknow approaches, detailing how the confluence of natural geography, man-made defenses, and the pre-existing urban plan created a deadly labyrinth that maximized the rebel advantage and demanded tactical ingenuity of the highest order. The city of Lucknow, situated on the banks of the river Gomti, was not a flat, open area conducive to the maneuver warfare at which the British traditionally excelled. Instead, the final approaches were defined by several natural and man-made obstacles that acted as layered, mutually supporting defensive belts. Firstly, the Dilkusha Park and the canal. The outermost barrier was the Gomti River itself, only crossable at limited points, and the extensive grounds of the Dilkusha Park. More critically, the approaches were bisected by a deep, brick-lined canal. This feature, though intended for irrigation, became a formidable military obstacle. Its steep banks and hidden rifle pits forced Havelock's troops into predictable choke points, exposing them to concentrated rebel fire. Crossing this canal, often under heavy fire, was a necessary, brutal preparatory action that consumed precious time and manpower. Secondly, the Bar and the suburban labyrinth. Beyond the canal lay a dense, disorganized collection of suburban settlements, mosques, tombs, and enclosed gardens, baghs. These structures, built largely of thick brick and mud, did not offer an open field of fire. Instead, they created a labyrinthine environment perfectly suited for decentralized, close-quarters combat. Every house was a potential fortress. Every high wall, compound, offered cover for snipers and concealed artillery positions. The fighting here was reduced from grand maneuver to a series of isolated, brutal struggles for individual buildings, demanding a shift in focus from broad front attack to micro-tactical excellence in urban clearing. Thirdly, the Alhambra. Serving as a critical staging point, the Alhambra was a large, walled garden enclosure that Havelock intended to secure as his base of operations. The rebel command recognized its value, heavily fortifying the area. The terrain immediately surrounding the Alhambra was broken and difficult, forcing Havelock to commit a significant, exhausting effort to secure this vital logistical hub before the final push could even begin. The necessity of leaving a sizable force to hold the Alhambra further depleted the final relief column, intensifying the impossible odds. Finally, the entrenched inner defenses. The innermost belt, protecting the residency itself, was a series of heavily fortified structures, the Kaisaba, Emperor's Garden, the Great Imambra, and other massive stone buildings. These were essentially internal bastions, forming interlocking fields of fire with thick, impenetrable walls that rendered traditional light artillery bombardment almost useless. The distance between the Alhambra and the Residency, a mere 3 miles, was militarily equivalent to a dozen conventional battlefields, requiring the column to penetrate 3 distinct, well-prepared defensive layers. The tactical ramifications of this ground were severe. The rebels had the decisive advantage of defense in depth, using the topology to channel, slow, and bleed the relief column. The British doctrine, which relied on the disciplined line and controlled volley fire over open ground, was rendered largely obsolete. The fighting became a matter of decentralized small unit action. Engineers had to be constantly at the front to breach walls, infantry had to clear buildings room by room, and the command chain had to navigate a landscape where visibility was often limited to a few yards. This close-quarters fighting maximized the use of the bayonet and minimized the strategic advantage of superior European training, raising the casualty rate alarmingly. The impossible ground of the Lucknow approaches was, therefore, the final, most sophisticated defense against Havelock's rapid advance doctrine. It was a perfect storm of geographical impediments and human fortification that forced the commander to abandon many of his established principles of open field maneuver. The final success would depend less on grand strategy and more on the granular details, the precision of the bayonet charge, the relentless work of the sappers, and the sheer, unyielding endurance of the individual soldier navigating this deadly, urban labyrinth. Securing passage through this ground was the final, non-negotiable prerequisite to the tactical climax. Havelock's advance was not defined by the weight of what he carried, but by the rigor of what he chose to leave behind. The art of the advance was, in essence, a radical logistical doctrine centered on calculated risk, directly contradicting the entrenched, cumbersome supply chain typical of the East India Company's military establishment. For Havelock, logistics was not a passive support function. It was a primary tactical weapon designed to enable speed, even at the cost of vulnerability. The central calculation was brutal: speed over security. A column large enough to fully secure its long, vulnerable supply lines from Cawnpore to Lucknow would have been so slow that it would have arrived after the Residency had already fallen. Havelock understood that the rebel advantage lay in the capacity of the Raj's military system to slow itself down. His solution was to ruthlessly minimize the supply train. This meant stripping the column of non-essential stores, excess baggage, and, most tellingly, minimizing the amount of heavy siege equipment. He rejected the prevailing military culture that demanded comfort and extensive provisions, focusing solely on the necessary minimums: ammunition, basic medical supplies, and just enough daily rations to sustain combat effectiveness. This meant accepting a strategic contradiction. The column was simultaneously an offensive striking force and an acutely vulnerable entity. Havelock's decision to prioritize ammunition and mobility over food and comfort was a direct reflection of his core tactical principle. The quickest way to end the logistical strain was to defeat the enemy and break the siege as fast as possible. Every day spent fighting a logistical battle was a day the enemy gained to strengthen their defenses. Therefore, the calculated risk of supply lines was the gamble that a rapid, decisive victory would negate the long-term threat to his rear, before the rebels could effectively interdict his sparse line of communication. The specific logistical implementation was highly unorthodox. Havelock relied heavily on light, rapid transport. Instead of the massive, slow-moving carts pulled by bullocks, the bane of previous campaigns, he utilized smaller, faster carts and relied extensively on the personal load capacity of his troops. Critically, he had to secure and maintain a reliable, dedicated reserve of reliable transport at Cawnpore, staffed by disciplined personnel. The failure of the preceding commands lay in the chaotic appropriation and mismanagement of transport. Havelock imposed an iron discipline on this aspect, recognizing that a lost cart of ammunition was far more disastrous than a temporary shortage of rations. Furthermore, his advance was predicated on the immediate exploitation of captured material. The successful engagements at Fatehpur and the subsequent actions were logistically vital not just for morale, but because they yielded essential resources, primarily the rebel artillery pieces and their accompanying ammunition. This ability to live partially off the battlefield was a testament to his flexibility and foresight, reducing his reliance on the fragile link back to Cawnpore. However, this logistical precision came at an immense human cost. The decision to forego extensive medical supplies and sufficient rest facilities meant that the already crippling rates of illness and exhaustion soared. The sick and wounded had to be left at the established holding points like Cawnpore or the secured Alamba, often with inadequate care, simply because moving them would fatally slow the main fighting column. This was the dark moral calculus of Havelock's command. The needs of the many besieged outweighed the immediate welfare of the few afflicted on the march. The advance itself became a self-sufficient operational unit. The entire column was instructed and drilled to maintain a high degree of tactical self-reliance. Unlike orthodox columns that might halt and wait for detached units or supplies, Havelock's force was required to be constantly ready to fight through blockades and clear roadblocks using its immediate, available resources. This elevated the importance of junior command initiative, as the pace often prevented centralized control over skirmishes. In summary, Havelock's art of the advance was a doctrine of strategic austerity and speed. He willingly exposed his supply line to risk because the alternative, moving slowly and securely, guaranteed strategic failure. His breakthrough was, therefore, as much a testament to his logistical discipline and calculated indifference to conventional safety as it was to the courage of his infantry. He chose the risk of being cut off over the certainty of arriving too late, a decision that elevated his strategic judgment far above the timid competence of his institutional rivals. The successful execution of Havelock's doctrine of the offensive relied not only on speed and logistics but on a precise, ruthless appreciation of the available weaponry and the calculated, almost philosophical commitment to the bayonet. Chapter 13 delves into the arsenal of the advance, detailing how the limitations and strengths of the era's firearms forced Havelock to adopt the bayonet's cold calculus, a strategic choice rooted in psychological warfare and tactical necessity, not merely desperate heroics. The primary infantry weapon of Havelock's column was the Enfield Pattern 1853 rifle musket. This was a muzzle-loading weapon, but crucially, it featured rifling that imparted spin to its mini-bore, offering significantly greater accuracy and range, up to 400 yards effectively, than the smoothbore muskets it replaced. The rebel forces, in contrast, possessed a mixed arsenal, including many older smoothbores and captured Enfields, often lacking consistent powder charges or reliable caps. This provided Havelock's trained European and loyal Sikh infantry with a distinct, though narrow, technical advantage in controlled volley fire at distance. However, the Enfield, despite its revolutionary accuracy, was still subject to the limitations of the muzzleloader. Its rate of fire was slow, approximately 3 to 4 rounds per minute, and the complexity of the loading process, especially under stress, in the intense heat, or, critically, in the close quarters, confusing environment of urban fighting like the Lucknow approaches, rendered it unreliable when continuous, suppressive fire was required. Furthermore, the smoke and confusion of the intense volley fire often obscured the target, demanding a precise, controlled discipline that only Havelock's rigorously drilled troops possessed. This technical reality informed the central tactical choice, the necessity of the bayonet charge. Havelock viewed the bayonet not as a weapon of last resort, but as a surgical instrument for tactical resolution. His doctrine dictated that prolonged, indecisive engagements, where his numerically inferior force could be encircled and worn down, were to be avoided at all costs. The purpose of concentrated rifle volleys and swift, light artillery fire was to shatter the enemy's formation and morale just prior to contact. The bayonet charge was the final, non-negotiable step to convert the enemy's disorganization into a complete, irreversible rout. The bayonet's cold calculus was a calculation of psychology over firepower. The bayonet, fixed to the end of the Enfield, created an imposing psychological profile. Rebel forces, often lacking the training and discipline to withstand a wall of disciplined infantry driven by overwhelming moral imperative, frequently broke and fled before the steel actually made contact. This tactic was highly economical. It achieved a decisive victory with minimal expenditure of precious, finite ammunition, and, ironically, often resulted in fewer British casualties than a protracted firefight would have. The role of artillery was equally specific. Following the lessons of Fatespa, Havelock did not waste time with heavy siege guns. He relied entirely on his light, mobile horse artillery. These guns were employed not for massive destruction, but for pinpoint tactical support. Their mobility allowed them to keep pace with the swift infantry advance, and their high rate of fire was utilized to quickly silence enemy gun emplacements or clear specific, fortified choke points, like the walls and bogs around Lucknow. They were the catalyst for the charge, softening the target just enough for the infantry to complete the task. The combination of the rifled Enfield's accuracy and the psychological terror of the bayonet was perfectly suited for the impossible odds scenario. It allowed Havelock's small force to hit hard, decisively, and then move on, conserving their limited ammunition and denying the enemy the chance to organize a protracted defense. The reliance on the bayonet charge was thus a strategic necessity imposed by logistical scarcity and the terrain, a hallmark of a commander who understood that his most reliable weapon was the unyielding, disciplined courage of his soldiers. This doctrine demanded a sacrifice of individual safety in the decisive moment to ensure the strategic security of the mission. The bloody fighting in the approaches to Lucknow would soon demonstrate the ultimate, unavoidable price of this cold calculus. The strategic failure of the attempts to relieve Lucknow preceding Havelock's command was rooted in their predictability. The rebel forces, led by highly capable local commanders, correctly anticipated the orthodox British approach, a direct, slow advance along the main avenues, relying on heavy artillery to blast a way through the established defenses. Havelock recognized that to succeed where others had failed, he had to deny the enemy the comfort of anticipation. His strategy for the final approach was built upon the creation of a false front, a deliberate, multi-layered deception designed to channel the enemy's resources toward a feigned point of attack while the real blow was delivered at an unexpected, militarily counterintuitive location. This strategic deception began with the denial of the obvious routes. The main, most direct line of advance toward the Residency ran through the heart of the city's entrenched suburbs and the heavily fortified Kaiserbar. This was the orthodox route, and thus, the most heavily defended. Havelock, by contrast, chose a circuitous, unconventional, and extremely difficult flank march that utilized secondary roads, difficult open ground, and the less defended edges of the city's defense network. This decision, seemingly riskier on paper due to the added miles and complexity, was in fact the only route that offered a viable chance of tactical surprise. The core of the false front lay in the management of his scarce artillery and cavalry. The British military tradition placed immense psychological importance on the presence of heavy guns and charging cavalry. Havelock deliberately orchestrated the movement of specific, visible, but non-essential elements of his column to create the appearance of a preparatory move toward the predictable axis of attack. Small detachments of cavalry and specific artillery batteries were ordered to engage in noisy, visible skirmishes along the main road, giving the rebel observers the distinct impression that the principal attack would come from the southeast, following the river. Crucially, this deception was supported by Havelock's unorthodox timing. His main column utilized night movements and rapid, silent marches that defied the norms of British operations in India. Moving a mixed column, with its inevitable noise of carts, horses, and men, in the monsoon-saturated darkness was technically challenging and highly prone to accidents and disorientation. Yet, this decision further concealed his true axis of advance, ensuring that by the time the rebel command realized the feint was a distraction, Havelock's main force was already committed to, or had begun, the assault on the actual objective. The strategic denial of the orthodox attack was, simultaneously, a political and a tactical statement. Politically, it demonstrated a revolutionary break from the predictability that the rebels had come to expect and exploit. It forced the enemy to spread their limited, yet numerically superior, resources across a wider defensive perimeter. Tactically, it allowed Havelock to execute his doctrine of tactical concentration at a point of his choosing. By drawing the enemy's expectation away from his real point of entry, he ensured that when his small, tired force did attack, it would not face the overwhelming, pre-positioned mass of the rebel army, but only a fraction of it, which his disciplined infantry could potentially overwhelm. However, this reliance on deception and flank movement carried inherent, immense risks. The unconventional route chosen by Havelock plunged the column directly into the urban labyrinth previously described, the tangled mess of walls, buildings, and narrow lanes that were impossible to survey and difficult to traverse even without opposition. Should the rebel command have discovered the true line of advance too early, the column would have been trapped in an environment entirely unsuited for the disciplined maneuver of the 78th Highlanders or the use of their mobile artillery. The success of the false front hinged entirely on the speed and precision with which Havelock could exploit the confusion he had sown. The final execution of the plan was a masterpiece of command initiative and control. The feint was maintained just long enough to draw the critical rebel reserves to the south. The main body, having executed its arduous flanking march, was then launched toward the bridgehead leading directly into the less expected area of attack. The shock of this sudden appearance, combined with the concentrated violence of Havelock's artillery fire and disciplined infantry charge, gave the breakthrough its initial, decisive momentum. The denial of the orthodox attack was thus the foundation of the impossible odds success. It was the intellectual victory that made the physical breakthrough even remotely possible. The strategic maneuvers and deceptions detailed in the preceding chapters culminated in the first breach, the terrifying, granular moment where Havelock's abstract doctrine was tested against the entrenched reality of the Lucknow defenses. This was the hour of the Highlander, where the 78th Regiment, along with the loyal Sikhs and others, were tasked with punching the initial, decisive hole through the enemy's fortified outer perimeter. This was not a general engagement but a technical, measured assault demanding extreme discipline and a precise adherence to the cold calculus of the bayonet. The target of the breach was a carefully selected weak point near the Chabar Bridge, chosen precisely because it was slightly less fortified than the main approaches, a testament to the success of Havelock's feint. The action was initiated not by the main body, but by pioneers and engineers who had to move under intense fire to prepare the ground. Their immediate task was to bridge the obstacle posed by the canal and clear the initial, hastily constructed roadblocks and rifle pits. This often involved the use of fascines and improvised materials, with every man exposed to the immediate, close-range fire from concealed rebel positions. The first breach itself was led by a vanguard, most famously the 78th Highlanders. Their role was absolutely critical. They were not to engage in a protracted firefight, which would have rapidly depleted their strength and ammunition. Instead, their mission was to achieve immediate, overwhelming psychological shock. The process was rigidly structured. 1. Concentrated fire preparation. The volley as the Highlanders advanced, they would halt and deliver massed volleys of Enfield fire at point-blank range against the visible defensive positions. The aim was not necessarily to eliminate every defender but to suppress the rebel fire and, most importantly, create a moment of genuine confusion and fear among the enemy rank and file. This was the transition point, the end of the slow, methodical advance, and the beginning of the kinetic assault. 2. The sprint and the shock. Immediately following the devastating volley, before the smoke had cleared or the rebel defenders could reload their muzzleloaders, the Highlanders were ordered to fix bayonets and sprint the final few yards to the barricade. This was the moment of maximum exposure and maximum risk. The casualty rates were highest here, as the column, confined to a narrow breach, was subjected to a hail of UN-aimed close-quarters fire. 3. The bayonet contact. This was the crucial tactical climax. The disciplined, rapid nature of the charge meant that the Highlanders crashed into the defenses while the enemy was still reloading, confused by the smoke, and psychologically shattered by the sudden transition from distant firefight to hand-to-hand combat. Havelock's doctrine proved true. The bayonet, wielded by disciplined infantry, was an overwhelming weapon in this context. The rebel defenses were often instantly fragmented, their cohesion broken by the shock of cold steel. The technical breakdown of this moment reveals its complexity. It required the perfect synchronization of multiple units, the artillery providing fire on the flanking positions, the engineers securing the breach, and the Highlanders executing the transition from volley fire to bayonet sprint with split-second timing. Any hesitation, any collapse of the front ranks, or any failure to achieve the psychological shock would have resulted in the entire column being trapped and annihilated within the confines of the breach. The success of the 78th was also contingent upon the flanking security provided by the loyal Sikh and native infantry. These men, fighting with extraordinary discipline, secured the perimeter immediately upon entry, preventing the rebel forces from surrounding the breach and cutting off the main column. Their knowledge of the ground and their fierce loyalty were indispensable in turning the initial, narrow breach into a viable staging point. This segment of the operation was characterized by a staggering, unavoidable cost. The casualty lists for the initial assault were disproportionately high in officers and senior NCOs, those whose duty compelled them to lead the charge and maintain formation integrity under the most brutal fire. Yet, the cost was considered necessary. By achieving a rapid, decisive rupture of the outer defenses, the momentum of the advance was preserved, and the column gained the critical foothold needed to navigate the urban labyrinth that lay between them and the Residency. The hour of the Highlander was thus a triumph of disciplined violence over brute force, achieving the impossible through the ruthless application of Havelock's speed-centric doctrine. The tactical achievement of the first breach merely secured a fragile entry point. It did not guarantee the relief of the Residency. The final, decisive act of the breakthrough was catalyzed by what can only be described as the Forgotten Charge, a singular, terrifying, and utterly unstoppable bayonet assault that constituted the genesis of the breakthrough. This moment represented the purest, most desperate application of Havelock's doctrine, where discipline and moral purpose overcame an absolute tactical deadlock. It was the ultimate test of the cold calculus established. Having pierced the outer perimeter, Havelock's column found itself immediately ensnared in the urban nightmare of the inner Lucknow approaches. The ground, a dense network of high-walled compounds, narrow streets, and fortified houses, negated the advantages of the rifled musket and mobile artillery. Every advance became an agonizing house-to-house fight, bleeding the column of its already scarce manpower. The rebel forces, decentralized but highly determined, used the cover to pour flanking fire into the slow-moving column. The momentum gained at the breach rapidly dissipated, and the advance stalled before a cluster of immensely strong, entrenched positions that formed the primary inner defensive ring. This deadlock centered on a crucial, heavily defended point, a massive, brick-built structure, likely a mosque or an imposing pucka house, which anchored the rebel line. This position commanded a key intersection, rendering further movement impossible without its elimination. The column was trapped in a narrow avenue, being systematically cut to pieces by unseen snipers and protected musket fire. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, the command chain was being decimated, and the sheer fatigue of the troops, having marched and fought continuously for weeks, threatened to turn the organized advance into a catastrophic rout. It was at this moment of maximum peril that the single, unstoppable bayonet was deployed, specifically by the decimated, yet still cohesive, ranks of the 78th Highlanders and the fierce Sikh infantry. Havelock's command decision was a direct repudiation of conventional prudence. The heavy losses and lack of clear objectives would have dictated a defensive halt, allowing the enemy to solidify their rings and ultimately trap the column. Havelock instead gambled everything on the one weapon he knew could reliably overcome a fortified position without succumbing to the slowness of siege warfare, the massed, disciplined charge. The genesis of the breakthrough was achieved not by complex maneuver, but by a brutal simplification of war. The order was given for the chosen regiments to advance without pausing for preparatory fire. This was the most daring aspect of the charge. By foregoing the standard volley, Havelock traded the immediate safety provided by suppression fire for the shock and speed required to close the distance. It was a conscious decision to minimize the time the men were exposed to fire, even if it meant maximizing the intensity of that exposure for a short, terrifying window. The charge was an act of pure, distilled moral determination. The Highlanders, their morale forged by the relentless professionalism Havelock demanded, fixed their bayonets and launched themselves into the face of point-blank musket fire. The sheer, overwhelming discipline of their formation, moving forward as an unyielding, unified mass, was the strategic weapon. They did not waver, even as the lead ranks were mown down. Their advance was so incredibly swift, so utterly devoid of the hesitation and fear that often precedes a charge, that it achieved a psychological victory before the physical engagement began. The rebels defending the position, expecting a cautious, protracted engagement, were paralyzed by the audacity and speed of the assault. They had prepared for a fight, they were confronted with a force of nature. The momentum of the charge carried the Highlanders over the barricades and through the doors of the fortified structures. The fighting that followed was close quarters, brutal, and swift. The disciplined British and Sikh infantry cleared the main fortress in minutes, using their bayonets and rifle butts in a frenzy of focused violence. The military implications of this single, focused assault were transformative. Re-establishing momentum, the capture of this anchoring position immediately cleared the bottleneck that had paralyzed the column, allowing the vital flow of men, ammunition, and the small field guns to restart. The strategic inertia was broken. Psychological shock, the speed and sheer, unyielding ferocity of the charge convinced the remaining nearby rebel forces that the column was not merely a relieving force, but an unstoppable, inexorable wave. Many rebel units, seeing their key defensive anchor fall so rapidly and brutally, began to abandon their adjacent positions, fearing a similar fate. Opening the corridor, the capture of the fortress opened up a viable, if still highly dangerous, corridor directly toward the Residency, bypassing several other prepared defensive lines. This forgotten charge was the crucial pivot point of the entire operation. It was not the most famous battle, nor was it the most prolonged engagement, but it was the genesis of the strategic breakthrough. It succeeded because Havelock's Forgotten Doctrine, the prioritization of speed, the cultivation of extreme discipline, and the absolute belief in the moral superiority of the offense, was perfectly suited to the impossible task. The bayonet, wielded as a symbol of unshakable resolve, performed its cold calculus flawlessly, trading the ultimate risk in a narrow window for the assurance of mission success. The moral cost was immense, but the tactical necessity was absolute. This single act of unflinching bravery cracked the rebel command structure, allowing the final, agonizing push to begin. The momentum generated by the forgotten charge brought entry, but it did not buy safety. Having breached the outer defenses, Havelock's column was immediately sucked into the most challenging environment of the entire campaign, the urban labyrinth of Lucknow's inner ring. The dense, maze-like layout of the old city, the narrow, twisting lanes, the impenetrable brick walls of the compounds, and the interlocking fields of fire created by the fortified buildings, stripped Havelock of all his conventional advantages. The Enfield's long-range accuracy was useless at 50 paces. The mobile artillery could only be deployed at high risk in exposed intersections, and the disciplined line of the Highlanders was reduced to small, fragmented squads fighting room to room. The battle was no longer a matter of doctrine and deployment, but of brute, sustained endurance. This environment fundamentally altered the nature of command. Havelock's role transitioned from a strategic director to an overburdened operational coordinator. Centralized command became functionally impossible. With communications constantly severed by the intense fighting and the physical obstructions of the city, success hinged on decentralized small unit initiative. Junior officers and experienced sergeants were forced to make life-and-death decisions, breach or bypass, advance or hold, clear the house or risk the flanking fire, with only the broadest understanding of the overall operational picture. The high rate of officer casualties in this phase was a direct result of the necessity for commanders to lead from the front, continuously exposing themselves to direct fire to ensure their isolated squads maintained direction and coherence. The fighting was characterized by relentless attrition. Every yard gained was purchased at an immense cost. The rebels, often hidden behind massive walls, fought with tenacity, utilizing the terrain they knew intimately. Snipers posted in high minarets and concealed on rooftops inflicted a continuous, debilitating drain on the column's strength. The constant need for sapping and mining, using engineers to blow holes through walls instead of risking men in exposed doorways, further slowed the advance, increasing the total time of exposure to fire. The column was literally fighting its way through solid stone and brick, consuming its finite reserves of energy and material. Crucially, the command decisions under fire had to address the horrifying moral reality of the wounded. With the column deeply engaged and movement restricted, evacuating the casualties back through the labyrinth to the relative safety of the breach point was slow, dangerous, and required diverting precious, combat-ready troops. Havelock had to make the agonizing choice to prioritize the advance over the immediate welfare of the severely injured, leaving them to the care of overworked, undersupplied medical staff in temporary shelters that were themselves vulnerable to rebel counterattack. This decision, though militarily necessary to prevent the column from becoming paralyzed by its own wounded, constituted one of the heaviest moral burdens of the entire campaign. The link-up with the existing garrison was not a neat convergence, but a chaotic, desperate final struggle. The last few hundred yards were the most dangerous, as the rebel forces recognized the impending failure of their siege and fought with final, concentrated fury. When Havelock's men finally made contact with the residence's exhausted defenders, the moment was less one of jubilant relief and more one of shared, immediate exhaustion and ongoing peril. The overarching strategic consequence of the fighting in the urban labyrinth was that the successful tactical breakthrough did not end the siege, it merely transformed it. Havelock's force, decimated by attrition and carrying its wounded, now found itself trapped inside the residency, compounding the pressure on the already stretched defenses and supplies. The reinforcements had, paradoxically, become new mouths to feed and additional bodies to protect, initiating the second siege. The initial objective was met, the garrison was reinforced, but the larger strategic goal of holding and securing Lucknow remained brutally distant. The tenacity and focus required from Havelock's command during this phase, the capacity to maintain discipline and forward momentum amidst such crushing structural chaos and human cost, is the ultimate testament to the Forgotten Doctrine's emphasis on moral integrity and professional training. He successfully guided a rapidly diminishing force through an environment designed to obliterate it, but the price of that achievement would define the final chapters of the operation. The physical and psychological exhilaration of the final link-up between Havelock's column and the beleaguered garrison at the Lucknow residency was immediately tempered by the grim reality of the price of entry. This was not the end of the operation but a forced consolidation of forces under renewed siege conditions. The first and most immediate technical cost was the staggering casualty rate sustained during the urban penetration. The relentless attrition in the urban labyrinth ensured that the column arrived profoundly weakened. A technical analysis of the casualty lists, which Havelock had to compile immediately for logistical and reporting purposes, revealed two critical, unsustainable facts. Firstly, the proportion of officers and non-commissioned officers, NCOs, lost was disproportionately high. These were the men whose training and initiative were essential for command integrity, and their loss severely impaired the remaining force's capacity for complex operations. Secondly, the overall percentage of combat-effective infantry was drastically reduced, converting a small, fast-moving attacking force into a slightly larger, but critically damaged, holding force. The fighting to secure a mere few thousand yards had consumed perhaps a third of Havelock's effective fighting power. This depleted force had to be immediately deployed to secure the newly enlarged perimeter. The technical cost of the relief was that the residence's defensible area had to be instantly expanded to accommodate the large influx of wounded from Havelock's column and the crucial supply train he had managed to bring. This involved violently clearing the immediate houses and compounds that overlooked the residency walls and the newly occupied area, turning a limited perimeter defense into a complex, multi-structure defense. This was a desperate, immediate, and high-casualty effort, requiring the immediate expenditure of men and ammunition at the moment of peak exhaustion. The material cost was equally severe. Havelock's column had expended a phenomenal amount of small arms ammunition during the continuous, close-quarters fighting. The disciplined volley fire and the necessary suppressive actions in the labyrinth had burned through reserves that were irreplaceable on the spot. While Havelock did bring in crucial supplies, they were rapidly consumed in the initial fighting to secure the new perimeter and were now subject to the duration of the second siege. Furthermore, the specialized tools of the engineers, sapping equipment, mining gear, and explosive charges were largely expended in breaching the walls and clearing the urban obstacles. This depleted state meant that the defender's capacity to conduct offensive mining or defensive countermining was critically impaired, making the defense more passive and reactionary. A technical analysis of the artillery exchange during the final push revealed the devastating effect of UN-aimed, close-quarters volley fire from the rebel positions. The rebels, using the thick walls for cover, often fired massive, UN-aimed volleys or even improvised canister loads at the advancing British and Sikh troops confined to the narrow streets. This fire, while lacking precision, generated a massive volume of fragments and musket balls that were guaranteed to hit something in the confined space. Havelock's infantry, in turn, were forced to reply with similar close-range, high-volume fire, often consuming ammunition simply to keep the enemy's heads down long enough to advance a few feet. The price of entry created a fundamental structural challenge for the surviving command. Havelock had successfully executed a strategy of speed and offense, which demanded continuous movement. Now, he was forced into a strategy of static defense, which demanded long-term logistical supply and extensive labor for fortifying positions, precisely the areas where his column was weakest and the Raj had historically failed. The exhausted survivors were immediately forced into digging, sandbagging, and clearing fire lanes under constant rebel bombardment, initiating the period of the Second Siege. The ultimate technical cost of the entry was the loss of operational flexibility. Havelock was now tied to the defense of the Residency. His small, effective field army, built for movement and shock, was dissolved into the stationary garrison. The only thing Havelock gained was the survival of the Residence's original inhabitants and a temporary boost in manpower and ammunition. He lost his freedom of action, his mobility, and the capacity to dictate the terms of engagement. The immediate fight to secure the perimeter was the final, high-cost expenditure necessary to prevent the technical success of the relief from instantly turning into the military disaster of annihilation. The conventional historical memory often compresses the events at Lucknow into a singular narrative of heroic relief. Scholarly scrutiny, however, must emphasize the critical distinction between the tactical success of Havelock's penetration and the resultant strategic paradox that immediately followed. The strategic contradiction was this: Havelock's column achieved its objective of reaching the Residency and bringing in vital supplies and men, yet by committing his entire force to the inner perimeter, he simultaneously eliminated his own operational mobility and expanded the defensive liability. His column, which was his greatest asset, a highly disciplined, fast-moving, and decisive offensive weapon, was instantly transformed into a static defensive element. The very principles of speed and shock that secured the breakthrough were rendered obsolete the moment the force was confined to the perimeter. This act of reinforcement had immediate, negative strategic consequences for the overall conduct of the rebellion. 1. Increased logistical strain. While Havelock brought in supplies, he also introduced several hundred new mouths to feed, along with a significant number of severely wounded men requiring constant medical attention. The already critically low reserves of food, ammunition, and, most crucially, medical supplies were not merely supplemented, they were divided among a vastly increased population. This meant the duration for which the Residency could hold out was not significantly extended, but the cost of every subsequent day of the siege was exponentially higher. 2. Loss of strategic initiative. By committing all his remaining combat effectives to the defense of the Residency, Havelock forfeited the ability to influence the wider strategic situation in the surrounding regions. His column was the only reliable, mobile European force in a vast area of revolt. Its immobilization meant that the rebel forces retained the freedom of action to consolidate their command, resupply their troops, and systematically tighten the cordon around Lucknow without fear of an external threat or flanking maneuver. The immediate consequence was the rapid establishment of the Second Siege, a far more organized and professionally conducted encirclement by the rebel command, who now understood the gravity of the threat. 3. Compounding the defensive challenge, Havelock's arrival necessitated the immediate expansion and reorganization of the Residence's defense, as detailed in the previous chapter. The existing garrison was exhausted and operating under established, albeit limited, defensive routines. The incorporation of Havelock's exhausted, wounded troops into new defensive positions created immediate command confusion, required immense labor in fortification under fire, and exposed the defenders to new, unanticipated vulnerabilities. The defense became geographically larger and tactically more complex, consuming the initial strength boost the reinforcement provided. The crucial difference between the first siege and the second siege lay in purpose and duration. The first siege was an endurance contest against uncoordinated rebel attacks, designed to hold out until a definitive relief arrived. The second siege was a strategic holding operation, a desperate, joint defense conducted by two exhausted forces, one static, one recently offensive, with the explicit aim of surviving long enough for a second, larger relieving army, eventually commanded by Sir Colin Campbell, to arrive. The nature of the gamble had changed from a race to a standoff. Havelock, the epitome of the aggressive commander, was forced to assume the role of a patient, defensive garrison officer. This forced shift was the final, devastating expression of the strategic contradiction. His tactical genius had secured the survival of the garrison, but the institutional failures that created the crisis meant that this tactical success could not be immediately converted into a strategic victory. The relief of Lucknow became a military problem that required not just a breakthrough, but the mobilization of a far greater force, a testament to the scale of the strategic quagmire. The political irony was also immense. News of the relief was hailed in London as a decisive, war-winning event, masking the uncomfortable truth that the entire combined force was now trapped, facing renewed danger, and awaiting yet another rescue. This strategic misrepresentation in Whitehall, focusing on the heroism while ignoring the peril, laid the groundwork for the subsequent political maneuvering that would seek to define or distort Havelock's legacy. His success was the creation of a desperate holding operation, not a conclusive victory. The relief of the Lucknow Residency was celebrated in London as a decisive, war-winning event, but this political hyperbole masked the grim operational reality that a lingering shadow of strategic crisis defined the immediate aftermath. Havelock's tactical success in penetrating the defenses did not, in fact, end the war. It merely preserved a crucial strategic asset at the cost of immobilizing the only effective mobile force in the region, ensuring the war's continuation across a broader, more volatile theater. The primary strategic consequence was the prolongation of the crisis and the re-establishment of the military status quo of siege warfare. While the defenders inside the Residency had been reinforced and morally boosted, the combined force, now larger, but far more desperate for supplies, remained trapped. The rebel command, having learned from its failure to prevent this immobilization of Havelock's column, had devastating repercussions for the war's continuation elsewhere. His force was the crucial fire brigade, the quick, sharp instrument necessary to address the scattered, yet coordinated, outbreaks of rebellion across the vital northwest provinces. With Havelock's troops pinned down in Lucknow, the rebel commanders elsewhere gained invaluable time and space to organize, fortify, and raise further forces. This relieved pressure on key rebel leaders, allowing them to transform localized mutinies into a more coherent, strategic threat. The strategic vacuum created by the tying down of the only effective field force ensured that the general uprising would escalate from a policing action into a protracted, full-scale military conflict requiring the mobilization of immense resources from Britain. Furthermore, the need to extricate both the original garrison and the trapped relief column, a task far more complex and resource-intensive, immediately required a total strategic reset by the British High Command under Sir Colin Campbell. The strategic goal shifted from a focused relief to a massive, logistical and military operation designed to subdue an entire region and safely evacuate thousands of individuals, both military and civilian. This demanded diverting troops from other theaters and delaying other crucial counterinsurgency operations, ultimately lengthening the war. The crisis at Lucknow, therefore, acted as a strategic drain, diverting critical resources and focus away from other centers of rebellion. A critical political consequence emerged in the strategic narrative, the exaggeration of the victory in Whitehall. The British government, under intense pressure from the public and Parliament following the horrors of Cawnpore, desperately needed a symbol of military success. Havelock's breakthrough, despite its precarious outcome, was seized upon and amplified as a moment of decisive triumph. This political expediency obscured the complex reality of the Second Siege, generating a false sense of security in London that hampered the immediate, full-scale strategic response necessary to end the conflict quickly. This narrative distortion served a political purpose but severely compromised military planning, as it downplayed the continuing, profound peril faced by the forces on the ground. The lingering shadow was also cast upon the moral conduct of the war. The immense suffering endured by the besieged, coupled with the horrific news from Cawnpore, fueled a relentless political demand for retribution. Havelock's successful, but high-cost, breakthrough reinforced the British belief in the efficacy of overwhelming force and unyielding military resolve. This set a grim precedent for the remainder of the conflict, influencing the often brutal and indiscriminate nature of the subsequent campaigns. The successful breach, necessitated by the failure of political expediency, ironically empowered a military doctrine that prioritized swift, often severe, repression over nuanced counterinsurgency. In essence, Havelock's tactical genius at Lucknow only highlighted the scale of the strategic mess created by the decades of political betrayal. His victory was the maximum possible result under the worst possible constraints. Yet, the institutional failures, the logistics, the political interference, the slowness of the overall response, meant that this brilliant tactical maneuver could not deliver a strategic conclusion, forcing the war to drag on and ensuring that the political betrayal would continue in the very halls of power that now hailed the hero's name. The true cost of the relief was not merely the casualties sustained, but the strategic extension of the conflict itself. The success of General Havelock's desperate breakthrough immediately triggered a political frenzy across the 1,000 miles separating the battlefield from the centers of imperial power. The first manifestation of this betrayal was the systematic distortion of the narrative by Havelock's superiors and rivals. While the press and the public demanded a heroic figure to embody the empire's resilience, the military establishment, which had consistently denied Havelock recognition for decades, could not afford the truth that a nonconformist, professionally rigorous commander had succeeded precisely because he ignored the institutional norms upheld by his peers. Specific dispatches sent from Calcutta back to London were often selectively edited or contextualized to diminish Havelock's autonomy and emphasize the role of officers connected to influential political factions. The narrative was carefully shaped to suggest that the success was due to the bravery of the men and the inevitable tide of British power, rather than the isolated genius of the commander and the corrective application of his neglected doctrine. Crucially, this maneuvering was designed to serve the political interests of the aristocratic and purchasing class that still dominated the army. Havelock's career had been a rebuke to the purchase system and the patronage that defined the Bengal army. Had his victory been truthfully acknowledged as a triumph of professional merit over political connections, it would have fueled reform movements intent on dismantling the expensive and inefficient system by which commissions were bought and sold. To protect their vested interests, the establishment had to de-intellectualize Havelock's success, transforming him from a scholar of war into a simple, brave hero, a falsification of merit that rendered his doctrinal insights harmless to the status quo. The most explicit evidence of this Whitehall betrayal lay in the early political responses to the relief. Havelock, operating under impossible conditions, had initially been under the command of Sir James Outram, who technically held a higher rank. Although Outram, with commendable grace, allowed Havelock to carry out the relief operation given his familiarity with the column and the mission's urgency, this chain of command was instantly exploited by political rivals. In the initial dispatches to London, the success was often attributed to the general efforts of the forces, or the overarching strategic direction set by Calcutta, thus diluting Havelock's singular credit. The ultimate affront was the delay and grudging nature of the political reward. While he was eventually lauded and granted a baronetcy, the initial, critical recognition was slow. The political machinery was visibly working overtime to ascertain the exact circumstances of the victory, not to reward him justly, but to ensure that his elevation did not unduly empower the professional class or embarrass those who had repeatedly passed him over. The honors, when they came, were framed as a reward for personal heroism, carefully divorced from any endorsement of his systemic criticism or unorthodox doctrine. This politicized recognition was a profound betrayal of a man whose entire career was dedicated to placing professional duty above political gain. Furthermore, the immediate strategic consequence, the fact that the relief had resulted in a second siege and a prolonged crisis, was used by cynical figures to cast retroactive doubt on Havelock's judgment. They argued that his advance had been too rash, too costly, and had merely compounded the problem, contrasting his high-risk doctrine with the eventual, slow, and methodical proper relief conducted by the arrival of the ultimate commander, Sir Colin Campbell. This political campaign was designed to retroactively sanitize the failures of the orthodox approach and marginalize the embarrassing success of the nonconformist. The legacy manipulation continued long after Havelock's death, which tragically occurred shortly after the second, successful relief force arrived. The subsequent official histories transformed him into a flawless, almost saintly figure, a simplification that stripped his life of its professional friction and intellectual depth. The narrative focused heavily on his piety and endurance, making him safe for Victorian iconography, but simultaneously burying the Forgotten Doctrine that was the true engine of his success. The military establishment successfully absorbed the hero while rejecting the inconvenient truth of his methodology, ensuring that the falsification of merit served to protect the very institutional rot that had necessitated his impossible triumph in the first place. The high political drama and strategic maneuvering surrounding Havelock's breakthrough often overshadow the grim, enduring reality faced by the individuals who executed the impossible odds, the common. The immediate aftermath of the breakthrough plunged the common soldier into a grinding reality of physical and psychological collapse. Having endured a relentless march, brutal close-quarters fighting in the urban labyrinth, and immediate, high-casualty action to secure the expanded perimeter, the men were utterly exhausted. The cessation of rapid movement, the defining characteristic of Havelock's advance, did not bring rest. Instead, they were immediately pressed into the brutal, static labor of the second siege, endless hours of digging, sandbagging, clearing debris, and manning the newly acquired, but vulnerable, defenses. This constant, debilitating labor, often conducted under continuous rebel bombardment and in the suffocating heat and poor sanitation of the congested residency, led to a surge in non-combat casualties. Dysentery, fever, and cholera, the true silent killers of the campaign, ravaged the ranks, proving far more lethal than the enemy's muskets. The psychological burden was immense. These men had witnessed horrors, endured privations that defied description, and then found themselves trapped once more, forced to defend the very lives they had so desperately fought to save. The lack of reliable intelligence, the constant fear of being mined or overwhelmed, and the sight of their comrades succumbing to disease and wounds created a state of continuous, low-grade trauma. For the Sikh and loyal native infantry, this psychological pressure was compounded by the knowledge that their families and communities were likely exposed to reprisals due to their allegiance, a loyalty that the company rarely repaid with adequate protection or reward. The burden of the Victoria Cross, VC, instituted just the year before, falls into sharp focus here. The VC was intended to reward conspicuous bravery regardless of rank or social standing, a seemingly democratic symbol of recognition. However, in the context of the overwhelming systemic failure and institutional neglect that defined the campaign, the VC became a symbol of sacrifice poorly requited. The men who earned it, often through acts of suicidal courage necessitated by command failure or the desperate need to stem a crisis caused by poor planning, were hailed as heroes, but the practical support provided to them, or to the vast majority who fought bravely but without official recognition, was profoundly inadequate. The reality after the war was harsh. While a few famous names received public acclaim and modest pensions, the majority of the surviving soldiers returned to a peacetime bureaucracy that quickly reverted to its ingrained parsimony. Many were discharged due to long-term injuries and chronic illnesses, the lingering physical cost of the monsoon, the exhaustion, and the urban fighting, only to find that the institutional support for long-term care, proper hospitalization, and adequate pensions was bureaucratic, stingy, and often humiliatingly difficult to access. The men who had saved the empire were often discarded by the state, their service reduced to a cheap citation and a negligible financial settlement. For the common soldier, the true cost of the entry was the permanent impairment of their physical and emotional health, traded for a tactical victory that barely moved the needle on the political ledger. The moral failing of the political class was not simply the initial betrayal that caused the siege, but the post-war betrayal that forgot the soldiers once the immediate political utility of their heroism had passed. The Victoria Cross, when pinned to a man struggling to survive on a meager pension and ravaged by chronic dysentery, served as a stark, unsettling reminder of the moral asymmetry between the price paid by the warrior and the gratitude extended by the state. Havelock's doctrine relied on the ultimate sacrifice of the disciplined soldier, and that faith was repaid in blood and endurance. The tragedy is that the institutional system he successfully bypassed in the field quickly reasserted itself after the fact, ensuring that the fate of the forgotten was to become a cautionary tale of a state that demanded everything and gave back the bare minimum. The most enduring and insidious form of betrayal following the relief of Lucknow was not directed at Havelock's person, but at his ideas. Havelock's success, the penetration of a massive, fortified urban area by a small, exhausted column, was achieved through the precise application of principles antithetical to the Bengal army's culture: speed over scale, discipline over duration, and logistical minimalism over bureaucratic hoarding. The tactical lessons were clear. The future of war in India required professional meritocracy, light and highly mobile artillery, rigorous training focused on shock tactics, and the absolute subordination of logistical bureaucracy to operational necessity. However, recognizing these lessons would have mandated a revolutionary overhaul of the military structure, threatened the established careers of politically connected officers, and required significant, immediate parliamentary expenditure, all actions vehemently opposed by the reigning status quo in Whitehall. To avoid this costly and disruptive reform, the political establishment engaged in a strategic act of historical distortion. The central mechanism of this distortion was the hyper-focus on heroism and moral destiny. Havelock was rebranded as a figure of pious, relentless courage, a model of moral virtue rather than tactical genius. His success was not attributed to his specific, detailed doctrine of concentrated volley fire and calculated bayonet charge. It was ascribed to the indomitable spirit of the British soldier and the belief in the righteousness of the imperial cause. This narrative shift was politically expedient because it required no institutional change. It implied that any well-meaning British officer, provided he was sufficiently brave and virtuous, could replicate the feat, thereby shielding the incompetent officer class from critique. Havelock's intellectual rigor was effectively neutralized by hagiography. This falsification of the tactical lesson manifested specifically in the analysis of the breakthrough. The bayonet as symbol, not strategy. The desperate, successful bayonet charges were celebrated as acts of spontaneous, inspired courage. The accompanying technical reality, that the bayonet was used as a calculated mechanism for shock to conserve ammunition and exploit the enemy's broken morale following precise, disciplined volley fire, was conveniently ignored. The lesson learned by the institution was simply, be brave and charge, rather than, train rigorously in volley discipline to enable a decisive, low-cost charge. This reduced the tactical lesson to a morale booster, absolving the command structure of the need for sustained, expensive training reform. The emphasis on relief, not breakthrough, the official narrative emphasized the arrival of the much larger, slower force under Sir Colin Campbell as the true relief, treating Havelock's earlier action as a precursor, rather than an essential, high-risk correction of the strategic failure. Campbell's approach, slow, methodical, relying on massive siege guns and overwhelming logistics, was comfortable and predictable. By elevating this conventional method, the establishment retroactively marginalized Havelock's speed-centric doctrine as an unnecessary, high-cost gamble, ensuring that future British commanders would revert to the safe, slower, more resource-intensive orthodoxy, the very method that had failed in the first instance. The neglect of logistical austerity, Havelock's achievement in moving a combat-effective force rapidly with minimal logistics, was the most radical aspect of his doctrine. The post-war bureaucracy ignored this, choosing instead to interpret the initial failures of 1857 as a need for more money and more men, a convenient conclusion for an establishment that desired expanded budgets and larger commands. The crucial lesson, that efficient management and logistical minimalism are vital, was replaced by the demand for expanded, expensive, and ultimately still inefficient logistical bulk. The consequence of this doctrine overwriting was profound. The British Army failed to absorb the critical lessons of mobility, flexibility, and decentralized command that Havelock's campaign offered. This failure would be revisited decades later in subsequent conflicts where the adherence to slow, conventional, and heavily supplied operations led to preventable tactical failures and increased attrition. The political expediency of protecting the aristocratic officer corps and minimizing reform costs was achieved, but it was purchased at the price of future military efficiency. Havelock's true victory, the validation of professional merit and strategic intelligence over political patronage, was thus systematically buried. The hero was enshrined in Westminster, but the doctrine that made him a hero was filed away and forgotten, ensuring that the institutional conditions for future, self-inflicted strategic crises remained firmly in place. The ultimate betrayal was the state's calculated rejection of the truth of its own salvation. The immediate closure of the Lucknow crisis, marked by the successful extraction of the combined garrisons by Sir Colin Campbell's larger force, finally allowed for a period of reflection on General Havelock's contribution. This reflection, however, leads not to simple celebration, but to an unsettling reckoning, a scholarly interrogation of the moral cost of his breakthrough and the complex, often manipulated, enduring political legacy he left behind. Havelock's victory, born of necessity and implemented with genius, forces us to confront the profound ethical compromises inherent in an imperial crisis born of systemic betrayal. The moral cost of the operation was multifold and extends beyond the staggering casualty count. The first cost was the calculated sacrifice of the individual soldier's health and comfort for the strategic imperative. Havelock's doctrine of the offensive, which prioritized speed over security and movement over rest, deliberately accepted high attrition rates from disease and exhaustion. This was a rational military choice, but an ethically profound one. He consciously traded the lives and long-term health of the men in his column for the survival of the besieged. The morality of command, under such duress, becomes a brutal form of triage, where the moral sanctity of every life is weighed against the ultimate preservation of the many. A second moral cost was the paradox of the reinforcement. Havelock's success condemned the entire combined force to the agonizing reality of the second siege. His breakthrough, while saving the garrison from immediate collapse, prolonged the period of acute suffering for both the original defenders and his exhausted troops. For weeks, hundreds of men, women, and children faced renewed danger, starvation, and disease, all because the scale of Havelock's success was insufficient to immediately convert the tactical victory into a strategic conclusion. The moral weight of the initial celebration was thus instantly supplanted by the moral responsibility of sustaining the protracted peril he inadvertently created. The greatest moral burden tied to Havelock's legacy, however, rests in its relationship to the subsequent severity of the repression. Havelock's initial advance and the ferocity of his disciplined charges were necessary tactical correctives to institutional failure. Yet, the news of his violent breakthrough, fueled by the genuine horror of the Cawnpore massacres, was co-opted by the political and military establishment to justify a subsequent policy of indiscriminate retribution. Havelock himself, a man of profound moral seriousness, often expressed discomfort with the more excessive measures of reprisal taken by others. Nonetheless, his success became a symbol of unyielding, overwhelming force, lending moral cover to the wider imperial campaign of suppression that followed, which was often marked by a brutality that far exceeded military necessity. His victory inadvertently provided the political momentum for the moral overreach of the rest of the war. The enduring political legacy of Henry Havelock is, therefore, a deeply ambiguous and manipulated construct. The heroic icon versus the uncomfortable reformer. As established, Havelock was politically sanitized, transformed into a figure of piety and pure courage, making him safe for public veneration. The crucial, inconvenient element of his legacy, his lifelong intellectual opposition to the incompetence and political favoritism of the military establishment, was deliberately suppressed. His enduring image is a tribute to individual virtue, a narrative that allowed the political system that failed him to continue operating unchanged. The justification of empire, Havelock's success, in the absence of a wider, organized victory, became the single, powerful justification for the continuation of the Raj. It affirmed the British public's belief in the moral destiny of the empire and provided the necessary evidence of military competence to maintain domestic support for the war. His name became inextricably linked to the narrative of imperial resilience and ultimate superiority, cementing the very system he had sought to make professionally honest. The posthumous reward and political closure, Havelock's death, shortly after the final relief, sealed his fate as a perfect, untarnished hero. He could be rewarded posthumously without the risk of him ever returning to London to press for the systemic reforms his victory implied. His honours, the baronetcy and the eventual statue in Trafalgar Square, served as a definitive political closure, diverting public scrutiny away from the systemic failures of command that had necessitated his impossible sacrifice. The unsettling reckoning is the realization that Havelock's achievement, though born of tactical genius and moral fortitude, was ultimately absorbed and distorted by the very political expediency he fought against. His legacy is not just one of victory, but a scholarly reminder of the profound moral compromises demanded by the defense of a system predicated on greed and institutional failure. His sacrifice saved the people in the Residency, but it could not save the political system from its own inherent rot. The narrative surrounding the relief of Lucknow, crystallized in memorials and textbooks, remains a cornerstone of the imperial mythology, a testament to courage, endurance, and the ultimate triumph of British moral will. This dominant historical consensus is, however, an enduring fiction, a deliberate, politically engineered suppression of the true tactical and doctrinal lessons of the campaign. This final chapter provides the final word on the siege by unmasking the institutional forces that actively perpetuated this fiction, thereby burying the uncomfortable truth of the systemic failures that necessitated the impossible odds in the first place. The core of the enduring fiction lies in its simplification of causality. The accepted narrative posits that the siege and the subsequent relief were fundamentally about the bravery of the individual, General Havelock's determination, the Highlanders' charge, the resilience of the besieged women and children. This emphasis on individual heroism is politically palatable, emotionally resonant, and, most importantly, strategically inert. It allows the public and the political class to celebrate the outcome without ever having to confront the systemic corruption and intellectual decay that created the initial disaster. The true narrative, that the crisis was a direct, predictable consequence of years of political expediency, logistical parsimony, and institutionalized incompetence, as detailed in Acts 1 and 2, is erased. This suppression of the true narrative was a necessary act of self-preservation for the status quo. Havelock's success, achieved by consistently violating the norms of the Bengal army, speed over logistics, merit over patronage, offense over caution, represented a living, breathing indictment of the orthodox military and political structures. To admit that Havelock's Forgotten Doctrine was the correct path would have been to admit that the aristocratic officer class, the purchase system, and the East India Company's civilian administration were responsible for the massacres and the near loss of a vital territory. Therefore, the official history, written largely by those who benefited from the existing order or those loyal to the commanders who superseded Havelock, performed two essential tasks. The marginalization of doctrine. Havelock's rigorous professional principles were deliberately de-intellectualized. He was made into an icon of moral courage, rather than a symbol of superior military science. By framing his achievements as acts of spontaneous spiritual or physical determination, the establishment successfully marginalized his true contribution, the methodical application of sound, neglected military principles that exposed the hollowness of contemporary British military education. The tactical lessons of speed, light artillery concentration, and bayonet shock, Act 3, were overwritten by the simple, non-replicable exhortation to be heroic. The elevation of conventionality, the subsequent, larger, and safer relief operation conducted by Sir Colin Campbell was amplified and elevated as the model of correct military procedure. Campbell's approach, slow, methodical, relying on immense logistical bulk and overwhelming firepower, was the safe, conventional orthodoxy. By celebrating Campbell's method as the definitive answer, the political establishment effectively retroactively condemned Havelock's necessary, high-risk genius as an aberration. This action ensured that the institutional preference for slow, safe, and easily controlled military operations, despite their proven failure in 1857, was reaffirmed for future generations. The enduring fiction is permanently enshrined in the political legacy of the event. It fostered a dangerous sense of inevitability in imperial military history, the idea that British arms, despite temporary setbacks, would always prevail through sheer moral force. This historical distortion created a false sense of security, delaying necessary military reform and preventing a genuine institutional reckoning regarding the deep-seated corruption that repeatedly threatened the empire's stability. The final word on the siege is a sobering one. The actual victory belonged to the forgotten genius and his doctrinal integrity, but the political victory, the control of the historical narrative, belonged to the systemic incompetence he sought to overcome. Havelock saved the garrison, but the system saved itself by burying the truth of his method and converting his revolutionary success into a comfortable, politically inert piece of patriotic folklore. The sacrifice of the common soldier, the cost of the breakthrough, and the truth of the tactical genius were all sublimated into the enduring fiction of a victory that required no introspection, no reform, and no change from the established, and ultimately failing, order.